Today, we're going to talk about Nauvoo, the city beautiful, after the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. So we know that Joseph Smith was martyred on June 27, 1844, in Carthage, a town about 23 miles from Nauvoo. We know at that very time that he was being martyred. We know that the town of Nauvoo was considered one of the largest towns in all of Illinois. In fact, some historians suggest that it was even rivaling Chicago at the time. But the question was, now that Joseph Smith, the president and prophet of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, had been killed there in Carthage, well, what happened to Nauvoo? So many people tend to think that Joseph died and Brigham Young immediately took the saints to the Rocky Mountains. But today we're going to learn that that isn't true. After the death of Joseph in Carthage jail, Willard Richards, one of the men that survived the mobocracy that occurred at the jail, wrote back a short note to be taken back to the people of Nauvoo. The note was, "Joseph the prophet is dead. Hiram the patriarch," meaning the patriarch for the church, "is dead. John Taylor is wounded." And then Willard Richards, who was a junior member of the Quorum of the 12, said at that time, "And I give my word, we will not retaliate." In other words, the Nauvoo Legion will not come to attack the town of Carthage. Individual citizens of Nauvoo will not come to attack the town of Carthage. It wasn't as if Willard Richards now accepted that Joseph and Hiram were dead and nothing would be done. It was just there would be no retaliation. As newspapers got word of the death of Joseph, they began to announce throughout the 26 states of the United States that not only was Joseph Smith dead, but it meant that his church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that was commonly called Mormon at that time, that Mormonism is dead. Now, the problem is that many of the saints living in Nauvoo believed that was the case. In fact, some of the saints started talking about they were going to move back to Kirtland, that those are the good old days, those were the glory days. That's where they were going. Still others said they were going to return to their homes, such as homes in Palmyra and perhaps even Missouri. There was even a group that took off from Nauvoo that were English born and bred, went back to England. In fact, in England, they literally believed that not only was the church now no longer existing, their conclusion was, we will hold meetings for a year in memory of the prophet Joseph Smith. There's one account where even the sacrament table was covered with black there in England, as well as curtains. So you begin to look and you begin to see it's being announced now everywhere where Latter-day Saints had lived that Mormonism was dead. What they did not account for was that was not the Lord's plan. They did not account for this man, Brigham Young. Brigham Young stood about 5 feet 10 at the time. He's 43 years old. He's president of the Quorum of the 12. He's red hair, freckled, and the temperament that goes with that kind of look. Now, Brigham Young, at the death of Joseph, was serving as a political volunteer to push forward Joseph's campaign for president of these United States. Brigham Young, as he now returns to Nauvoo from being out there in the greater Boston area, he comes back, and as he comes back, he's not only the president of the Quorum of the 12, but he's been trained in his youth to be a carpenter and a builder. In his mind, Nauvoo was not a place that was going to be vacated. The church was not destroyed. It would continue on. In fact, he was heard to say that Nauvoo is now poised for expansion. As we think of this, many of us have had an opportunity to be out to Nauvoo. The little red part that you see is a peninsula jutting out into the Mississippi, and that's Nauvoo. Many of us have had a chance to be in Nauvoo, live in Nauvoo, vacation in Nauvoo, and we go there and we say, think bigger, as we now talk after the martyrdom. For many of us that have gone to Nauvoo, we know that the most frequented vacation spot is always the Scoville Bakery, where kids, adults can go in there and receive cookies that were typically baked through the winter. We also know that in Nauvoo you can go into the Browning gun shop and there learn how to make the old guns of the West. We also know in Nauvoo you can see the red brick store, which was recreated and restored there in 1980 as a sesquicentennial remembrance of the church, the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or some may even drive by the Mansion House. But when you look at Nauvoo and you see, well, how is it? We'd all say it's a quaint little town, far away, not close to an airport. And as you look at the census reports of Nauvoo, you'd be able to see since 1860, the town really hasn't grown. And by 2010, you can look at it and say it's even less than in 1860. So if you'd grown up in Nauvoo and you decided to live in Nauvoo, you would just think having children and their children that the town would expand. If you were to look at Nauvoo in 2020 and actually look at the county in which it's a part, Hancock County, the county only increased by one person. And so what you're looking at when you go to see Nauvoo today, you think, oh, the Saints, they abandoned a small town, and that it wasn't that big of a deal, that Brigham was planning on going anyway. And from this hour, we're going to learn to think bigger. Why are we thinking bigger? And it's because as Brigham Young now returns to the Nauvoo area, his decision is he's going to officially change the name of the town. Now, the town has had many names as it's gone through, the years in the United States. For example, it's been known as Venus and Commerce and Nauvoo. And you'd say, well, Brigham, what do you do? And he changes the name of the town to City of Joseph. In other words, this was Joseph's city, and he wants everyone to remember it who's in town. He had remembered that Joseph Smith considered it wisdom to make an attempt to build up a city. Joseph talked about Nauvoo, or now City of Joseph, was going to be a light unto the world. Now, Joseph was the architect. He started to build that light unto the world. You get an idea of how was the city then during the time of Joseph before the martyrdom. He had designated that there would be 24 streets, north and south, and 31 east and west. The streets were not named like you'd say out in Utah, where you'd say 100 south, 200 south, and so forth. You'd say the streets were named after Joseph's friends. So notice there's a Parley P. Pratt Street. There in Nauvoo, there's an Orson Hyde Street, a John Taylor, a James Mulholland, who was Joseph's secretary, Samuel Carlos and Hiram Streets, named after Joseph's brothers. We also know during Joseph's time, the typical house was some kind of a log cabin block house or a clapboard house. And the typical house was not a brick house like you see today. The typical Latter-day Saint in town, he had his house, he had a garden in the backyard, and he typically had some kind of a shop next to his house, whether the shop was a drugstore, whether he was a tinsmith, a barrel maker, whatever he was. The typical thing you saw during Joseph's lifetime was a kind of a log house with a garden and a shop. And you'd say, what was Nauvoo? And it was a community of farmers. Now, a community of farmers meant that the individual had a house in town, and then he had a house on the outskirts of town. So when they lived in Nauvoo, the time that they actually lived in Nauvoo is after harvest. So sometime in October, Nauvoo becomes a really big city at Joseph's time, growing to about almost 12,000. But when was it a big city? It was a big city from October to about April. And then what would happen is the city, many would move out to their farmhouses, much like we know of people that have a house in town and, say, a cabin or somewhere else that they go to spend some of their times. Now, because the typical 19th century man was a farmer and then had a trade on the side, such as a school teacher, a blacksmith, a doctor, and so forth, Nauvoo was the hub of a wagon wheel. In other words, it was the hub of what you would say would be many spoke cities linked to Nauvoo. For example, the Lord tells us in Doctrine and Covenants, section 124, verse 2, "This stake which I have planted to be a cornerstone of Zion," meaning the stake of Nauvoo, "which shall be polished with refinement, which is after the similitude of a palace." Now, the first settlers in Nauvoo were those that had struggled from their time in Missouri. Many of those who first then settled Nauvoo, you'd say they'd gone through the extermination order, where the saints were basically forced out of Missouri, crossed over to Quincy, and came up to Commerce and then Nauvoo and now city of Joseph. As they did so, Joseph Smith organized them into wards. Now, during his time, there were 4 wards in Nauvoo, but these wards are political. And you can't find the word ward in the Old Testament, New Testament, Book of Mormon. Wards are political in nature. So, for example, when I had a home in Nauvoo, I attended the Nauvoo First Ward, but politically, I was in the Nauvoo Third Ward. When Joseph organized his people into wards, they were at first in what was called political wards. In those political wards, there were elections, much like you might say a neighborhood chair in the area in which I live. So from a political ward, you elected a city councilman. You elected the head of the Nauvoo police, the brigade in your ward. You elected a justice of the peace, and you had ward teachers. Eventually, bishops were assigned to those, quote, political wards. Now, as we look at Nauvoo during Joseph's time then, we have 4 political wards. Within each ward, almost they're autonomous to some extent. You ultimately have a bishop, a city councilman, which eventually serve as the high council. You have Nauvoo police, justice of the peace, and ward teachers. We know that Nauvoo is going to expand. We had our first foreign missionaries called to be missionaries to the Lamanites. We now, by the time of Nauvoo, we've got missionaries that are going beyond the 26 states of the United States to the British Isles. The impact was actually huge. By the time we look at Nauvoo, now city of Joseph under Brigham Young, 1/4 of the community is British born and bred. They had never known the prophet Joseph. So much like Latter-day Saint pioneers, when they crossed the plains, they all came to Salt Lake City, and then they were assigned to settle in different settlements, such as Taylorsville or Willard or Logan or Ogden or Provo or St. George. It was the very same thing in Nauvoo. As they arrived in Nauvoo, they will be assigned out to branches connected with Nauvoo because every head of household was expected to be a farmer. So with that said, you get the idea that Joseph Smith was not only the architect of Nauvoo, but he was a community builder. And as these newcomers are assigned out to the various branches, notice what happens. You get Latter-day Saint settlements all over in 3 counties in Illinois and 1 county in Iowa. So, for example, notice in Adams County, by the time you're looking at the end of the life of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young now returning, you'd say we have branches that are settlements that are all connected to Nauvoo that, for the most part, composed of Latter-day Saints. So there's Freedom, there's Payson, there's Lima, and so forth in Adams County. In Pikes County, you've got Union and Burton and Liberty and so forth. But notice, you'd say in Hancock County, of which Nauvoo is a part, notice you can look at this and you can find 21 different communities that were founded by the prophet Joseph Smith that are branches connected to the various wards in Nauvoo. If you look over here to Lee County, across the river from Nauvoo, notice all the different branches that you find over there. You've got Nashville and Zarahemla and Ambrosia and so forth. So with that, you'd then be able to look and say, how many Latter-day Saints were really living then in the greater Nauvoo area that had ties to Nauvoo? And I go, thousands and thousands and thousands. We're looking at 20, 30, 40,000 people who are spread out through parts of Illinois and now across the river to Iowa. The reasons that would bring all these kind of farming type of families back to Nauvoo go like this. Why would you gather to Nauvoo? And you'd say, you'd gather to Nauvoo during General Conference. So during General Conference times, if you lived in Nauvoo, you'd open your doors, and it's a wonderful time to welcome visitors that are coming for a General Conference. Now, notice when conferences are held. They're held the beginning of April. Well, the beginning of April, after conference, what happens? Those who live in Nauvoo now move out to their farmhouses. And then you'd say, when's the next conference? Well, it's October. Why hold it in October? You'd say, those that are now, they're pulling in their crops, they're gathering things, it's harvest time. They come in for a conference, and as they come in, they're now going to live in Nauvoo as a permanent. So one reason that brings people to Nauvoo who live in all of these small spoke communities in the various counties in Illinois and 1 in Iowa is to attend General Conference. Another reason for people coming to Nauvoo who are Latter-day Saints is to bury their dead. And I remember one time being in Nauvoo and being next to President Hinckley, and he described Nauvoo as a cake, and he said most of it's frosting. In other words, go see the Scoville Bakery and the Browning Gun Shop and everything, but he said, but the part that's really the cake, he said, is go to the cemeteries and go to the Nauvoo Temple. Burying the dead. Burying the dead, how they used to do it is they would bury their dead on Monday and Thursday. You'd say Thursday was the old Jewish tradition day that Moses climbed up to Mount Sinai to commune with God, and Monday was the day that he came down with the Ten Commandments. So you'd say you'd bury your dead on Thursday and Monday. When Joseph was alive, he liked to speak at those funerals. And what you can find at those funerals and the various burial sites there in Nauvoo was as the dead were being buried, Joseph introduced what we now know as temple work and talked about husband and wife can be together for all eternity, that you'll have your children for all eternity. So another reason to come to Nauvoo, in addition to general conference, is if you lived across the Mississippi and Iowa and someone in your family died, you would bring that person to be buried in the city of Nauvoo. Another reason to come is that each one of those little branches out there were assigned to contribute to the Nauvoo Temple. Now, some will actually contribute, wood and nails and glass and things like that. Others will contribute food from their farms for those that worked on the Nauvoo Temple. And so there was literally like a tithing allotment from those little communities. And when you had a harvest or something, you would bring those in so that they could be given to the workers of the temple, who would often go to Joseph Smith's red brick store to be able to get their allotment for working on the temple. Another reason to come to Nauvoo was to be a shopper. If you were to look at all of those small settlements, those spoke settlements way out there, only Yellowrome, and notice it's a town founded by Isaac Morley, and it's Morley spelled backward, okay? Only the town of Yellowrome had 4 stores. And that was the most number of stores you can find in these little communities. So if you needed to shop, you would come to Nauvoo. Nauvoo had business districts. Notice there was a business district on Mulholland Street, much like there is today. You can go on Main Street. Well, that's where you find the Scoville Bakery and Riser Boot, and that's Main Street. You could go on Parley Street, another business district, if you needed help with wagons, and on Water Street, general stores and newspaper. Now, what was so interesting about shopping in Nauvoo is that shopping was basically done by men. Now, if you were to go to a mall today and you'd say, where are the women? They're inside shopping. Where are the men? They're sitting in the aisle kind of between all the stores, just waiting for their wife to come out. But back then, shopping was done by the man. And the reason is that there was a lot of trading going on. And so even though you'd say there are 38 general stores in Nauvoo, pretty much by the end of the day, every store, even if it was a tinsmith, is a little bit of a general store because people have come in town to barter and to trade products. Now, the businessman would like to receive cash, and that was the medium of exchange you most wanted. But the businessman was also willing to take short or long credit. Short credit meant that within probably the end of the month, you'd be able to pay up for what you bought. Long credit meant they were willing to wait till harvest time. You would also come in not only to shop, but for services. And services included such things as they had dentists in town. Alexander Nybar is the man you see under there were 12 dentists. He was Joseph Smith's personal dentist and fixed his tooth that had been chipped during the tar and feathering back in 1832. There were also 12 midwives in town, and there were 12 doctors. One of those doctors being Willard Richards, a member of the 12. To show what a good doctor Willard Richards was, is that at one point a man came to him and needed to have his leg cut off. Willard cut off his leg and charged the man $50.50. The man said to Willard, just round it up. I only want to pay $50. And Willard said, no, he said, I charged you $50 because I knew how to cut off your leg, and 50 cents because I did it. And so what you've got is if you needed services, you're going to come to Nauvoo for services. Also, if you needed architects, attorneys, bootmakers, drugstores, grocery stores, you're coming. Notice how big it was. There were 11 hotels in Nauvoo. There were 11 mills. There were 4 stone quarries. Steamboats would go up and down the Mississippi River, and they would dock. You could see as many as 9 steamboats a day. If you wanted your clothes tailored or to purchase clothes, there were several tailors in town. One even just, he specialized only in doing Nauvoo Legion uniforms. But what was interesting in Nauvoo, with all the shopping, bartering, credit that was going on and all the services given, there were no banks in Nauvoo. And you go, oh, that's so different than today. It's not like we see a bank on every corner, but there's an ATM or something where you can get cash. But there were no banks in Nauvoo, and the reason is that Illinois had suffered, like the whole nation in 1837, from a national banking crisis, and then in 1841, a personal estate crisis, and nobody seemed to trust the banker. So no banks in Nauvoo. You also came in from all those little communities if you wanted refinement. So they had a cultural hall. They had a music hall that would seat 600. You came into Nauvoo if you wanted to have some kind of special education. They had common schools, private schools, secondary schools, seminaries, and even a university. In all those little communities out there, every man 18 to 45 was a member of the Nauvoo Legion, even over in Iowa. What I find pretty interesting is they also had strong business associations. And it's the first time you begin to see the beehive as a symbol being used as the business associations. Notice these were associations so they could teach one another, and hopefully at some point in those little small communities, they'd be able to set up their own tailor shop. Now, of all those associations in town, they're all men, and you'd say the largest one was a big field. In other words, let's help everyone to be a better farmer. Wherever you're at, come on in. We're going to have meetings. We're going to talk about what you do to the soil, what's the best things to plant in this soil. They also had a trade union meeting in which they planned to build a bridge across the Mississippi, and they planned to be able to send their goods downriver. Now, the only association that had women in it was called the Straw Hat Association, in which women were taught how to make straw hats that would ultimately be sent down the river to St. Louis, and that becomes a precursor to what we know as the Female Relief Society of Nauvoo, and actually now the Relief Society of Nauvoo. Well, have you got the idea? Everything went big. So when you go to Nauvoo and you say, oh, it all looks so small, I'm going, nope. It was large. They were spreading out literally over, hundreds of miles. And you'd say, but what stopped all of it? What we've got, you've got all these little communities. You've got reasons that they would gather into Nauvoo. But when do all of these little communities stop? So, for example, I can go to Bear Creek. I know I'm on the right spot and go, where is everybody? Where are the buildings? And I'm saying everything stopped November 15th, 1845. A man named Edmund Durfee was killed. He is the next man to be martyred after Joseph and Hiram Smith. He is killed in the small settlement of Yellrome there in Illinois. When Edmund Durfee is killed, Brigham Young sends out the word and says, abandon the spokes. In other words, abandon the spoke communities and everyone come into Nauvoo. When is Nauvoo the largest? And I'd say, oh, that's easy. Are you talking before the death of Edmund Durfee or after? After the death of Edmund Durfee, Nauvoo is huge. Nobody would consider their house their house. In other words, you were more than willing to bring into your home people who had lived out in the small spoke communities. As the people came in, Brigham Young has other announcements. The big announcement that he wants, he pulls all people off of public projects in Nauvoo. In other words, if you were someone who had been asked to work on the Nauvoo house, say in Nauvoo, or you had been finishing up some things at the music hall or the cultural hall or any of the other public projects, you're pulled off. And Brigham Young now says, the most important thing we can do is finish the temple. He now says to the people, we are about to prepare to go west. And he said, I don't want to take a people west unless they have been endowed, in other words, to receive a gift from God. When is the Nauvoo Temple worked on 24/7? And I go, after the death of Edmund Durfee. At this point, you get fires being set at each of the corners of the Nauvoo Temple so people can continue to have light to be able to work on the walls. The walls at the death of Joseph were about 18 feet high. You'd say, when is that temple finished and moving forward? After the death of Edmund Durfee, and everyone comes in. The plan now was to prepare to leave Nauvoo, prepare to literally flee Nauvoo. Everybody begins to second-guess Brigham. When will he say flee Nauvoo? Some will say, surely he will say it in the summer. And, we have a better chance. We have perhaps one more chance to grow things. And others will say, well, maybe he'll say spring before we get our things in the ground. But notice when Brigham says flee Nauvoo, it's the dead of winter, February 4th of 1846. Well, what have we learned today? When Joseph died, people literally thought that not only had the prophet been killed, but that Mormonism was no more. But what we have learned is the church is that little stone that it's cut out with out hands that's rolling forth to fill the whole earth. We've learned a lot about Nauvoo. I hope you've heard that, and that in Nauvoo, always think bigger. Nauvoo expanded after the death of Joseph. Nauvoo expanded on the Illinois side of the river. It expanded on the Iowa side of the river. And you'd say it was prosperous. They had business associations. They had political things going on. They were building on the temple. Everything seemed to be looking good until Edmund Durfee died. When Edmund Durfee dies, suddenly all those big plans, all the little cities that have been founded, everything folds up. And as it folds up, the people come to Nauvoo. What does Brigham Young think the most important thing is? Go to the cultural hall, the music hall. I'm going, no way. The most important thing is complete that temple, get the endowment, be prepared. We're about to flee Nauvoo. Well, Nauvoo. In conclusion, as the people left Nauvoo, can you imagine? They have now built up Nauvoo. It is not just those little houses that were kind of log cabins with a garden and the shop on the end. Remember, the town is now called City of Joseph. Brigham has asked the people to now build their houses or their shops or their barns or their lands and to build them in memory of the prophet Joseph Smith, because after all, it's the City of Joseph. I've heard some people say, well, I can't believe, Heber C. Kimball's house. It's gorgeous, one of the prettiest houses in Nauvoo. It's brick, and he only lives there about 40 days. And I go, he never planned on it. It was his memory of Joseph Smith. I recall that Wilford Woodruff, at one point, he's out at the farm of John Benbow. John Benbow had a much more famous farm in England, but as Wilford goes to his farm, he looks at it, and when he sees Brother Benbow, he says, Brother Benbow, he goes, I don't think the Garden of Eden could be as beautiful as I now see your farm today. And Brother Benbow said, oh, thank you, Wilford. I've just dedicated my farm to the memory of Joseph Smith. For Wilford Woodruff, he personally counted every brick that went into his house. He wanted to have the biggest memory of the prophet Joseph. And, okay. So what do we have by the time it's Flee Nauvoo or Flee City of Joseph? You have a city that's a light unto the world. You have a brick city. And as you have this brick city, it's in memory of the prophet Joseph Smith. So in Nauvoo, you can see mission vans that say Spirit of Joseph. And people, as they walk the streets, they go, do you feel the Spirit of Joseph on these streets? Well, for sure you will. In conclusion, I love Nauvoo. I've had a home there for about 15 years. I visited it numerous times. There is a spirit in old Nauvoo. It's the spirit of Joseph. It's the spirit of those who loved him. It's a spirit of compassion as you get people taking into their homes those that have been out in those little spoke communities. And it's a spirit to sacrifice all, to follow Brigham Young to an uncharted west, literally in the Rocky Mountains. I am very grateful for those saints who loved Joseph and were willing to sacrifice their all to follow Brigham Young and the 12 to the west. And I say this humbly in Jesus' name, amen.